He was always the one who showed up first. The one who texted first. The one who made plans, reached out, checked in, while everyone else just took. Every time he stopped reaching out, the silence echoed louder than he expected. It wasn't that they forgot him. It was that they never saw him in the first place. And one day, he just stopped. No announcements. No dramatic goodbyes. He disappeared from the group chats, left messages on read, and didn't explain. At first, he felt guilty. Then he felt free. That's when he learned a lesson no one teaches you. The more you chase people, the more they run. But when you stop, when you focus on yourself, they come back, not because you called, but because your silence became louder than your words ever were. This is not a story about losing people. It's a story about how to become someone they can't ignore, even in your absence. He started noticing a pattern. The more effort he gave, the less he received. Friends who only replied when they needed something. Conversations that felt one-sided. Plans that fell through unless he was the one pulling the strings. It didn't happen all at once, but over time, he realized he had become addicted to the chase. Not just of people, but of validation. He equated effort with value, thinking if he just gave more, cared more, they'd meet him halfway. But they never did. So, one evening, in the quiet of his room, he made a decision. No more chasing. No more checking his phone every 5 minutes. No more wondering why they hadn't called back. That first day felt strange, like walking without a crutch. But by nightfall, something shifted. His mind was quieter. His energy wasn't leaking into dead conversations. And for the first time in months, he realized that stepping back wasn't loss, it was clarity. Without the constant need to be seen, he started seeing himself. Really seeing. He began waking up with purpose instead of people. Mornings became sacred. He read. He moved. He built routines not for likes or applause, but because they made him feel alive. His room, once cluttered with distraction, became a space of calm. And little by little, his focus returned, not outward, but inward. He picked up hobbies he'd forgotten. Journaled his thoughts. Sat in silence and let his emotions rise without judgment. It wasn't easy. The old version of him still whispered, maybe if you text her, she'll respond this time. But he ignored it. Because he wasn't building this new self for her, or anyone else. He was becoming the person he would have chased. The kind who walks with peace, who doesn't need to be loud to be seen. And something unexpected happened. The less he reached out, the more people began to notice his absence. He didn't expect them to notice. In fact, he assumed they wouldn't. After all, his messages had gone unanswered for weeks before he stopped sending them. So when his phone buzzed 3 days after his silence began, with a simple "Hey, you okay?" from someone who hadn't checked in months, he stared at it for a moment before setting it back down. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. He had spent too long trying to fill empty spaces with his presence, thinking it would make him indispensable. But silence had done what words never could. It made people wonder. It made them pause. It made them realize they had taken him for granted. More messages followed. Not floods, but trickles. You've been quiet lately. Miss you in the group. We should catch up. He didn't respond immediately. Not because he was trying to play games, but because he was no longer driven by urgency. He was finally choosing to be intentional with his time. He had learned that when you stop giving people unlimited access to you, they begin to value the moments they do get. Silence wasn't punishment, it was a recalibration. A way of asking, without asking, do you value me, or just my availability? The old version of him would have rushed to reply, afraid they'd forget about him if he waited too long. But now, he understood that true connection doesn't disappear just because you stop trying so hard. If anything, the right people will lean in when you lean back. He wasn't ghosting. He wasn't angry. He was just done proving his worth in places that never saw it. Every unread message became a quiet affirmation, I no longer chase. I attract. And he began to understand that silence isn't empty. It's full of power, boundaries, peace, and sometimes, the answers you've been looking for all along. He had stopped chasing, but he hadn't stopped growing. In fact, the growth only began after the silence. With every day that passed, he felt himself changing, not in dramatic, visible ways, but in subtle shifts that rewired something deep inside. It began with presence. He no longer scrolled his phone endlessly, waiting for someone to reach out. He no longer refreshed apps hoping for attention. He started pouring that energy into himself, into his routines. His mornings were no longer rushed and reactive. Now, they were intentional. He rose early, not for show, but for self. The soft glow of dawn became his first companion, and the silence, once unbearable, now felt like a friend. He didn't start with a grand plan. He just committed to one thing, showing up for himself. Each day, he set a small intention: drink more water, move his body, read 5 pages of something meaningful, write one thought down. And every time he followed through, his confidence grew, not in loud, brash ways, but in quiet, grounded strength. He started noticing details again: the way the sunlight filtered through his window, the warmth of his coffee mug, the texture of paper under a pen. Life, stripped of noise, became rich again. And without realizing it, he became magnetic. People began to notice. Not because he posted his transformation online. He didn't. In fact, he barely spoke of it. But energy doesn't need captions. There was something different about him now. The way he walked, more upright, less hurried. The way he listened, fully, without jumping to fill silences. The way he responded, not reactively, but thoughtfully. He had become someone you noticed when they entered a room, not because they demanded attention, but because they carried peace like a shield. He didn't shrink anymore. He didn't perform. He just was. And that authenticity became impossible to ignore. One day, an old friend messaged, "I don't know what's changed, but you seem lighter. Different." He smiled, not because he wanted praise, but because it confirmed what he already knew. When you stop chasing people, you make room for yourself. And when you fill that space with presence, purpose, and peace, you become the kind of person people want to be around, not because you begged for it, but because you embodied it. He no longer felt the need to explain his boundaries. If someone didn't respect his time, he simply created distance. Not with anger, but with clarity. He started saying no more. No to plans that drained him. No to conversations that went in circles. No to people who only remembered him when they were bored or broken. And strangely, the more he said no, the more people respected him. They stopped assuming he was always available. They started considering whether they were adding value or just taking space. His life became simpler, quieter, but never lonely. What surprised him most wasn't that people came back, it was who did. Not all of them. Some remained silent, and that was okay. But the ones who returned, they returned differently. With humility. With honesty. They asked real questions. How have you been, really? I noticed you've been growing. What changed? And for the first time, he didn't feel the need to shrink his story to fit their expectations. He shared it as it was, slow, messy, but honest. No filters. No edits. But not everyone who returned stayed. And that, too, became a lesson. He realized that magnetism doesn't guarantee permanence. Some people are only meant to orbit your growth, not participate in it. He stopped forcing connections that no longer aligned. If someone's presence disrupted his peace, he let them go. Gently. Without drama. Because when you found stillness within, you guard it like gold. Professionally, things shifted too. He stopped chasing opportunities and started creating them. He invested time in his craft, and slowly, his work began speaking for itself. Offers appeared in his inbox. Collaborations he once dreamed of became possible, not because he marketed himself aggressively, but because he built something real. Quiet consistency had become his loudest voice. While others hustled for visibility, he cultivated depth. And in a world full of noise, depth always finds a way to rise. Even in love, the dynamic changed. He no longer sought affection as a way to fill a void. He wasn't looking for someone to complete him. He was already whole. And that wholeness became its own kind of attraction. He drew people in not with lines or charm, but with stillness. With truth. With the energy of someone who knew who he was, and wasn't afraid to be alone if no one matched it. He didn't fear rejection anymore. Because now, he understood that what doesn't come toward you with peace was never meant for your path. There were still moments of doubt, of course. Days when the silence felt heavy. Nights when he missed certain voices. But those moments no longer defined him. They became part of the process, reminders that growth isn't linear, and that healing often feels like losing before it looks like winning. He welcomed those feelings without shame. Sat with them. Listened. And then kept going. In time, something profound happened. He stopped wondering who would text him next. He stopped checking who watched his stories. He no longer kept score. The game had ended. He was no longer playing for validation. He was living for peace. And in that space, people didn't just come back, they stayed. Not all, but enough. And they stayed not because he chased, but because he changed. Because his silence had matured into strength. Because his absence had turned into presence. And because he had learned, at last, the truth: you don't need to chase what's real. What's real finds you, when you become real yourself. He stood in front of the mirror that morning, not to fix his hair or straighten his clothes, but just to look at himself, truly and silently. The reflection staring back at him wasn't someone who had gained the world. He didn't have millions in the bank. He wasn't famous. No viral posts. No spotlight. But still, for the first time in his life, he felt wealthy, internally. Rich in stillness. Wealthy in boundaries. Full of peace that hadn't come from someone else's approval but from his own quiet decision to stop chasing. He didn't smile for the mirror. He didn't need to perform anymore, not even for himself. There was a depth in his gaze that hadn't been there before, a calm that said, I am no longer begging the world to see me. I've finally seen myself. And that single shift, one most people miss, had changed everything. Because chasing doesn't just exhaust your feet, it wears down your soul. Every unanswered message, every ghosted call, every cancelled plan where they didn't even bother to text back, had once chipped away at his identity. And it wasn't just romantic relationships. It was friends who only reached out when they needed something. Family who guilt him into being someone he wasn't. Workplaces that praised his effort but drained his spirit. He had once bent himself into every shape imaginable just to be liked, chosen, remembered. But now, he was choosing something far rarer, self-respect. And self-respect is quiet. It doesn't scream. It doesn't clap back. It simply walks away from anything that no longer honors its presence. That's what he had learned, the hard way. He stopped asking, why don't they love me back? And started asking, why do I keep offering myself to people who don't see me? That was the beginning of the shift. That was when his healing began. At first, it was lonely. Of course it was. Growth always is. When you stop chasing, there's a silence that wraps around you. Not many talk about that part. The empty inbox. The plans you weren't invited to. The awkward moments when people who once relied on your eagerness now vanish in your stillness. It hurts. Because for a while, your brain tells you, you're losing everyone. But the truth is, you're only losing the ones who never truly chose you to begin with. And in that silence, something else starts to grow: discernment. The ability to see who's real and who's convenient. The power to feel when someone's energy is inconsistent. The courage to walk away when you've been quiet for days and no one noticed. He started using that discernment not as a sword, but as a compass. A way to steer toward peace, toward authenticity, toward the people who clapped for him when no one else was watching. And the more he invested in that stillness, the more he started attracting things he never had to chase. Genuine conversations. People who followed up without being asked. Opportunities that aligned with his values. Love that didn't come with conditions or silence as punishment. Friendships that didn't feel like a transaction. His energy had changed, so what found him had changed too. Now, when someone leaves his life, he doesn't panic. He doesn't spiral, wondering what he did wrong. He simply pauses and thinks, that chapter served me, but it's over now. He no longer fights to hold on to people who are already halfway out the door. He blesses their path. He lets them go with grace. Because when you believe in your own presence, you don't need to fight for space in anyone else's life. That doesn't mean he became cold. Far from it. He still loved deeply. He still cared. But now, his love had boundaries. His care had a backbone. He no longer gave 100% to people who gave him 30. He didn't play the prove your worth game anymore. He stopped running marathons for people who wouldn't take a single step for him. And instead, he poured that energy back into his own soil. He began planting again, not seeds in other people's gardens, but in his own. Projects that made him feel alive. Passions he had buried while tending to everyone else's dreams. Books he always wanted to write. Places he wanted to explore. A version of himself he had long forgotten, the one who laughed at his own jokes, sat in cafes with a notebook, and felt alive just watching the rain hit the window. That man was back. Not because someone brought him back, but because he stopped abandoning himself to chase people who never stopped walking. And with each step forward, he became magnetic. Not the kind of magnetic that draws crowds, but the quiet kind that pulls in real ones. People who saw his peace and didn't try to disturb it. People who heard his silence and didn't take it personally. People who knew that connection isn't measured in how loud you can be, but how deeply you can show up. One evening, as he walked home under a sky brushed with golden hues of sunset, he paused by a quiet bench. He sat down, breathing in the stillness. Around him, people passed, laughing, talking, lost in their own worlds. He watched, not with envy, but with presence. And in that moment, it hit him, he was no longer chasing people. He was no longer chasing life. He had slowed down enough for life to finally catch up to him. And it did. In small ways, like a text from someone who genuinely cared. In large ways, like a job offer from a place he'd never applied. But more importantly, in sacred ways, like waking up and not feeling anxious about who stayed or left. Because when you become someone who values peace over approval, you become someone others seek, not to fix, not to use, but to learn from. To sit with. To grow alongside. He was no longer chasing people. He had become the kind of person people chase, not because he needed them to, but because his presence reminded them of what home feels like.